Healing makes you dangerous. Most people think healing will make them happier. Carl Jung believed something far more disturbing. Healing first makes you dangerous. Not dangerous in a violent sense, but dangerous because you begin seeing things that most people spend their entire lives avoiding: patterns, contradictions, and the hidden motives behind ordinary behavior. You start noticing how often people confuse attachment with love, control with care, and obedience with connection. Once that perception shifts, something uncomfortable happens. You can no longer participate in certain relationships the same way. The laughter still sounds normal. The conversations still happen. The routines remain untouched, but underneath it all, you begin sensing the invisible negotiations taking place inside almost every interaction. Who needs validation? Who needs control? Who fears abandonment? Who survives by manipulating perception? Suddenly, human behavior stops looking random and starts looking predictable. Jung once wrote that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid confronting their own soul. Watch closely, and you'll see how true that really is. Some people stay busy to avoid themselves. Some stay desirable. Some stay needed. Some stay wounded, because pain can become an identity, and identities do not disappear quietly. Why healing creates conflict before it creates peace. That is why healing often creates conflict long before it creates peace. The moment you stop tolerating what once felt normal, people begin reacting to you differently, not because you became cruel, but because you became harder to control, often without anyone consciously realizing it. A person who fears abandonment can be guilted. A person starving for validation can be manipulated. A person afraid of loneliness will betray themselves just to keep someone close. But a person who has confronted their inner emptiness becomes unpredictable. They no longer beg for closeness. That costs them their self-respect. This is where the real transformation begins. Not when you love yourself, not when you become confident, but when you finally notice how much of your previous tolerance came from psychological survival. Most people are not patient, they are afraid to leave. Most people are not understanding, they are emotionally dependent. Most people are not too nice, they are terrified that rejection will confirm what they secretly believe about themselves. So they endure things that slowly destroy them: disrespect, inconsistency, humiliation disguised as jokes, emotional neglect disguised as independence. And they call it love, because the alternative is facing a terrifying possibility that many of their relationships only survived because they had no boundaries. People don't always react to your healing with admiration. Sometimes they react with irritation, distance, or subtle hostility, because your growth forces them to confront the version of you they benefited from. The unsettling part is this: the more conscious you become, the less you can tolerate unconscious behavior pretending to be normal. The quiet exhaustion behind healing. The unsettling truth about healing is that it rarely begins with strength. It usually begins with exhaustion, not the dramatic kind people notice, but a quieter kind. The kind that comes from constantly translating your pain into something socially acceptable. Smiling while resentment builds beneath the surface. Pretending certain comments don't bother you. Staying emotionally available for people who disappear the moment you need the same in return. For years you called it maturity. Then one day you realize it was survival, and survival creates strange personalities. The persona we build to survive. Carl Jung believed that the personality most people present to the world is often a mask, a carefully constructed identity, designed to gain acceptance, avoid rejection, and maintain a sense of belonging. He called this the persona. The terrifying thing about the persona is that eventually even you start believing it. You become the understanding one, the calm one, the reliable one, the easygoing one. And because people grow comfortable with that version of you, they begin expecting it permanently. They stop seeing your humanity and start seeing your function. That's why healing shocks people. The role suddenly changes. The person who always tolerated disrespect begins going silent. The person who always over-explained starts saying less. The person who constantly made themselves emotionally available suddenly becomes unreachable. Others interpret this as arrogance, but often it's the first honest thing you've done in years. People don't resent your weakness, they resent the possibility that you might outgrow them. That realization changes the atmosphere around you. You begin noticing how many social interactions are built on invisible power dynamics rather than genuine connection. Some people only feel safe around you when you are uncertain about yourself. Some relationships survive only because you were carrying all the emotional weight alone, and healing quietly removes your willingness to carry it. This is why growth often feels socially disruptive. Once self-respect enters the room, many relationships lose the chemistry that kept them alive. You stop laughing at things that humiliate you. You stop rewarding inconsistency. You stop chasing closure from people committed to misunderstanding you. And strangely, this doesn't always make you feel powerful. Sometimes it makes you feel deeply alone. Because awareness isolates before it liberates. Seeing attention for what it is, you begin seeing conversations, compliments, and even attraction differently. You notice how some people are drawn to your wounds, not your soul. Your insecurity made them feel powerful. Your emotional availability made them feel important. Your lack of boundaries made them feel safe from accountability. But now something inside you has shifted. You no longer confuse attention with care. This is where healing becomes psychologically uncomfortable. Because the more conscious you become, the harder it is to maintain the illusions that once protected you from reality. You start realizing some people never loved you, they loved their access to you. Your silence, your forgiveness, your emotional labor. Your patience. Not you. Once that realization enters your mind, ordinary interactions begin feeling strangely hollow. You start hearing manipulation hidden inside concern, possessiveness hidden inside affection, envy hidden inside jokes. The social world begins revealing its shadow. And the worst part is that most people don't even know they're doing it. That's what makes human behavior so disturbing. Once you begin seeing clearly, very little of it turns out to be fully conscious. People speak in rational language, but beneath the surface, older forces are moving them. Insecurity, fear, envy, loneliness, shame, and the desperate need to feel significant. The Shadow Jung understood this better than most. He believed every human being carries a shadow, the hidden part of themselves they refuse to acknowledge, the impulses they deny, the emotions they suppress, the traits they condemn in others, because they cannot face them within themselves. The shadow does not disappear because it is ignored. It leaks into relationships, into friendships, into love, into family, especially into the people closest to us. That's why healing changes your perception so dramatically. You begin noticing that many conflicts aren't actually about the surface issue at all. The friend who's angry at your success isn't upset about your success, they're confronting their own stagnation through you. The partner accusing you of changing is often terrified of losing control over the dynamic they'd grown comfortable with. The family member mocking your boundaries feels subconsciously threatened by the fact that you're breaking patterns they normalized long ago. Awareness transforms ordinary conversations into psychological mirrors. And most people hate mirrors because mirrors force confrontation. There's a reason some people become irritated the moment you become healthier. Your healing silently exposes what they avoid confronting inside themselves. A person comfortable living unconsciously will always feel unsettled around someone becoming conscious, not because you attacked them, but because your transformation interrupts the fantasy that their own behavior is normal. Most relationships don't end when respect disappears. They end when awareness appears. That's the part nobody warns you about. What healing reveals about you healing doesn't just reveal others, it reveals you, and the versions of yourself you created to survive. You begin remembering how often you abandoned your own instincts just to maintain connection, how many times your body sensed danger before your mind allowed itself to admit it, how often you betrayed yourself trying to avoid being abandoned by others. Slowly, an uncomfortable truth emerges. Many people are not afraid of losing relationships. They are afraid of losing access to validation, to emotional labor, to control, to familiarity. That's why boundaries provoke such intense reactions. Healthy people may not always like your boundaries, but they usually respect them. Manipulative people experience boundaries as rejection, because your limits interfere with their access. Once you see this pattern repeatedly, something inside you changes permanently. You stop feeling guilty for protecting your peace. You stop explaining boundaries to people committed to violating them. You stop mistaking tolerance for virtue, because tolerance becomes dangerous when it forces you to betray yourself. The healed version of you starts understanding something darker about human nature. Many people will only love you as long as you remain useful to their emotional needs. The moment you become difficult to control, difficult to guilt, difficult to drain, their perception of you changes. Suddenly you're selfish, cold, different, too much. But what actually changed is simpler than that. You stopped negotiating against yourself. And for people who benefited from your lack of self-worth, that transformation feels like loss. Turning the question inward, there comes a point in healing where you stop asking, "Why did they treat me that way?" and begin asking something far more dangerous. "Why did I accept it for so long?" That question changes everything, because now the spotlight turns inward. The mind usually wants villains: clear betrayal, obvious manipulation, visible cruelty. But healing forces a darker realization. Some of the suffering in your life continued because part of you was psychologically attached to it. Not consciously, but deeply. Jung believed that what remains unconscious controls us from beneath the surface. Many people unconsciously repeat painful relationship patterns because familiarity feels safer than freedom. The nervous system prefers predictable pain over unfamiliar peace. That's why people return to relationships that drain them, why they confuse emotional chaos with passion, and why they feel strangely uncomfortable around healthy love. The wounded mind often interprets calmness as emptiness because it was trained to associate intensity with connection. This realization becomes deeply unsettling once you begin seeing it everywhere. You notice how some people only feel emotionally alive inside instability, how they create conflict when peace arrives, how they sabotage closeness the moment vulnerability becomes real, not because they enjoy suffering, but because suffering became psychologically familiar. The human mind will cling to what is familiar, even when it is destroying itself, and that includes identities, especially identities. Losing the identity built to survive for years, maybe your identity was built around being needed, being chosen, being understanding, being emotionally available, no matter how poorly others treated you. Healing threatens that entire structure, because if you are no longer sacrificing yourself for approval, who are you? If you stop rescuing everyone who stays beside you, if you stop overextending yourself emotionally, who still calls? Those questions create a terrifying emptiness, because healing is not just losing unhealthy people. Sometimes it feels like losing the entire personality you built to survive loneliness. And in that silence, something strange happens. You begin noticing how much of society rewards self-abandonment. People praise you when you overgive. They admire your patience when it benefits them. They call you mature when you tolerate disrespect quietly. But the moment you prioritize your own psychological well-being, the tone changes. Now you're distant, hard to reach, too serious, changed. The truth is, most social systems are designed to preserve comfort, not truth. Healed people become disruptive because they stop participating in the emotional performances that keep dysfunctional dynamics alive. You stop pretending disrespect is accidental when it's repeated consistently. You stop calling emotional neglect busy schedules. You stop translating bare minimum effort into love. Awareness sharpens your perception until excuses begin sounding hollow. That creates another painful realization. Many relationships survive not because they are healthy, but because one person is willing to tolerate emotional imbalance indefinitely. Once tolerance disappears, the relationship begins revealing what it truly was. That's why healing often feels like waking up inside your own life and suddenly recognizing the architecture of every interaction around you, the power dynamics, the emotional dependencies, the subtle manipulations, the invisible negotiations happening underneath ordinary conversation. And after enough awareness, you can no longer return to sleep. Reading patterns instead of words. Once that awakening begins, something irreversible happens to your perception of people. You stop listening only to words and start studying patterns. The delay before someone replies once you finally stop initiating. The sudden change in energy when you become confident. The discomfort certain people feel when you no longer need their validation. You begin realizing that human behavior is rarely random. Most people reveal themselves indirectly, not through what they claim, but through what consistently repeats. Repetition is where the unconscious exposes itself. A person may tell you they care about you, while repeatedly disrespecting your boundaries. They may promise loyalty while disappearing whenever your life becomes inconvenient to them. They may speak kindly to your face while subtly competing with you underneath the surface. The conscious mind speaks in language, the unconscious speaks in patterns. That realization changes the way you experience almost every relationship. You notice how some people need you insecure, because your insecurity keeps the hierarchy intact. As long as you doubt yourself, they remain psychologically above you. Your healing silently threatens that structure. The unspoken agreements behind relationships. This is where social dynamics become darker than most people are willing to admit. Not every relationship is built on love. Many are built on unconscious agreements. I will stay small so you feel comfortable. I will overgive so you don't leave. I will suppress my needs so this connection survives. These agreements are rarely spoken aloud, but they control entire relationships for years. Healing breaks the contract. And when the contract breaks, people often reveal who they truly are beneath politeness. Some become distant, some become defensive, some suddenly accuse you of changing. Occasionally the reaction becomes even darker. They try to pull you back into your old identity. The agreeable version, the guilty version, the emotionally dependent version. Because people often feel safest when you remain psychologically predictable. Growth makes you unpredictable, and unpredictability threatens control. That's why certain people become irritated when you become calmer, more self-contained, more emotionally independent. Your peace removes their influence. There's a disturbing truth hidden inside many social interactions. Some people do not want connection. They want access to your attention, your reassurance, your emotional energy, your softness. The moment access becomes limited, their behavior changes. Suddenly the affection fades, the effort disappears, the warmth turns conditional. That's when healing forces one of the hardest realizations a person can experience. A large percentage of human relationships are transactional beneath the surface, not always financially, but emotionally. Psychologically, socially, people stay where their emotional needs are fed. And once you stop feeding certain dynamics, you discover which relationships were sustained by genuine care, and which were sustained by your willingness to abandon yourself. Guarding against bitterness, that realization can make the world feel colder. For a while, you may even become emotionally detached, hyper-aware, suspicious of everyone, the mind swinging too far in the opposite direction because it's trying to protect itself from ever becoming unconscious again. But Jung warned about this too. The goal is not to become numb. The goal is to become conscious without becoming consumed by bitterness. And that requires confronting something even deeper than other people's behavior, your own shadow. The shadow is not just the darkness inside you. It is the version of yourself you were taught to hide to remain loved. Your anger, your selfishness, your ambition, your envy, your need for recognition, your capacity to leave. Most people spend their entire lives trying to appear good, while unconsciously burying every trait that might threaten acceptance. But buried emotions do not disappear, they wait. And eventually they begin controlling behavior from underneath the personality. That's why people who suppress anger often become passive-aggressive. Why people who deny insecurity become obsessed with superiority. Why people who pretend to be endlessly selfless secretly resent everyone around them. The shadow always finds expression, consciously or destructively. Healing forces you into confrontation with this hidden part of yourself. And honestly, this stage terrifies most people because it's easier to see manipulation in others than dependency within yourself. Easier to notice narcissism in others than control within yourself. Easier to condemn betrayal than confront your own fear of abandonment. But real awareness destroys this illusion of moral purity. You begin realizing that even your good behaviors sometimes had unconscious motives beneath them. You weren't always kind purely from love, sometimes you were kind because you feared rejection. You weren't always patient because you were emotionally mature, sometimes you were patient because confrontation terrified you. You weren't always giving because you were generous, sometimes giving became a strategy to earn worth. Everyone is a contradiction. That realization hits the ego like cold water, because suddenly your entire identity becomes less certain. The mind wants to divide people into good and bad, victim and villain, healthy and toxic. But the deeper you understand human nature, the more complicated everything becomes. Everyone carries contradictions. The same person capable of deep love may also be capable of manipulation. The same person capable of loyalty may also betray when fear overwhelms them. The same person capable of kindness may secretly envy the people they care about most. Human beings are not stable creatures, they are psychological battlegrounds. Once you truly understand this, you stop expecting perfection from others. But something else happens too. You stop romanticizing them. That changes your entire perception of attraction, relationships, and even friendship. You begin noticing how often people fall in love with fantasies rather than reality, projecting idealized identities onto each other. Because seeing clearly would destroy the illusion holding the connection together. Most relationships survive through selective blindness. Healing removes that blindness. You stop ignoring inconsistencies because someone is attractive. You stop excusing emotional instability because someone is charming. You stop confusing chemistry with compatibility. Awareness teaches you something painful. Intense connection does not always mean healthy connection. Sometimes trauma recognizes trauma. Sometimes wounds recognize wounds. Sometimes loneliness recognizes loneliness, and people mistake psychological familiarity for destiny. Eventually, healing creates a strange emotional shift. You no longer crave intensity the same way. You start craving truth, even if the truth is colder, even if it ruins illusions you once needed to feel loved. Illusions comfort the ego, but they quietly destroy the soul. Finding clarity in solitude eventually, healing reaches a stage where your entire relationship with loneliness begins to change. At first, loneliness felt like rejection. Now it starts feeling like clarity. You realize how much noise existed in your life, simply because silence forced you to confront yourself. How many relationships were maintained, not from connection, but from fear of being alone with your own thoughts. Most people would rather remain emotionally crowded than psychologically honest. Because silence reveals things. It reveals dependency. It reveals insecurity. It reveals how often attention was used as anesthesia against emptiness. When healing strips those distractions away, many people panic. They rush back toward old relationships, old habits, old emotional patterns, not because those things were good for them, but because unconscious suffering feels more familiar than conscious solitude. That is why so many people sabotage their own healing. Awareness becomes unbearable when identity has been built around dysfunction. The person who spent years being needed feels worthless without someone to rescue. The person addicted to validation feels invisible without constant attention. The person conditioned to chase emotionally unavailable people feels strangely empty when someone finally treats them well. Because healing does not only remove pain, it removes the identities attached to pain. And identity loss feels like death to the ego. Consciousness hurts, Carl Jung once said. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Most people read that sentence intellectually. Few understand what it actually means. Consciousness hurts because it forces you to watch illusions collapse in real time. You watch yourself outgrow conversations that once entertained you. You watch your tolerance disappear for behaviors you once normalized. You watch your emotional attachment fade toward people you thought would remain in your life forever. And perhaps the darkest realization of all, some people only fit into your life when you hated yourself. That realization changes the emotional atmosphere permanently. You begin understanding why certain relationships suddenly stop functioning once your self-respect grows. Your healing disrupts the emotional hierarchy the relationship depended on. The insecure version of you was easier to control, easier to guilt, easier to manipulate through fear of abandonment. But the healed version becomes dangerous, not violent, not cruel, just unwilling. Unwilling to beg for consistency. Unwilling to chase reciprocity. Unwilling to keep translating disrespect into miscommunication. Choosing peace over attachment. This creates distance between you and the world around you. Because most social environments quietly depend on unconscious compromise. People tolerate what drains them because confrontation risks isolation. They stay inside familiar emotional prisons because freedom requires uncertainty. But once awareness fully enters your life, you start noticing something strange. Peace becomes more attractive than attachment. You stop needing everyone to understand you. You stop trying to convince people of your value. You stop forcing emotional intimacy with people incapable of meeting you deeply. In that state, something cold but liberating emerges. You realize that many people never actually saw you. They saw the role you played in their emotional world. The healer, the listener, the pursuer, the forgiving one. But healing stripped the performance away, and once the performance disappeared, so did many of the relationships. After enough healing, you stop experiencing people the same way, not because you become heartless, but because illusion no longer protects your perception. You begin noticing how fragile most identities really are. How quickly kindness disappears when someone feels embarrassed. How fast loyalty changes when status enters the room. How often morality bends under loneliness, desire, fear, or social pressure. Human beings like to imagine themselves as rational creatures, but most behavior is emotional survival wearing intellectual clothing. People betray values to preserve belonging. They betray people to preserve ego. They betray themselves to avoid abandonment, and usually they justify it afterward with language that sounds reasonable enough to protect their self-image. That's the frightening thing about self-awareness. The deeper you look into human psychology, the harder it becomes to see anyone as entirely innocent, including yourself, especially yourself. The final confrontation eventually. Healing forces one final confrontation. You realize that part of your suffering came from wanting reality to be emotionally softer than it truly is. You wanted loyalty to guarantee permanence. You wanted love to guarantee honesty. You wanted effort to guarantee reciprocity. But human nature does not operate according to fairness. People change when emotions change, needs change, fears change, identities change, and many connections that feel eternal are actually temporary psychological alignments between two unfinished people. That realization can make the world feel unbearably cold at first, until another realization quietly replaces it. The point of healing was never to become naive enough to trust everyone, nor cynical enough to trust no one. It was to see clearly, to stop demanding permanence from temporary things, to stop confusing emotional intensity with meaning, to stop sacrificing yourself, trying to earn what should be given freely. Because the more conscious you become, the more you understand something almost nobody wants to admit. A large portion of human interaction is driven by unconscious need for validation, need for certainty, need for control, need to escape loneliness, need to feel superior, need to feel chosen. And once those needs disappear, many relationships disappear with them. That is why healing changes your social world so dramatically. You are no longer relating to people from hunger, you are relating from awareness. And awareness changes the energy completely. You become slower to attach, harder to manipulate, less seduced by charm, less impressed by appearances. You stop asking, "Do they like me?" and begin asking, "Who do I become around them?" That question alone can dissolve entire relationships, because some people pull you toward anxiety, some toward performance, some toward self-doubt, some toward emotional exhaustion, and others toward peace. Listening to the body, real healing teaches you to notice the difference, not through words, but through your nervous system, through the silence after conversations, through the tension in your body, through whether your spirit expands or contracts around certain people. Because the body notices what the mind tries to rationalize. And maybe that is the final realization, hiding underneath all of this. The more you heal, the less you tolerate. Not because you think you're better than others, but because you finally understand the cost of betraying yourself. Once you've experienced the psychological exhaustion of abandoning your own instincts long enough, peace stops feeling lonely, it starts feeling sacred. Maybe that is the final tragedy of human nature. Most people never lose others. They lose themselves trying not to. They spend years tolerating disrespect to avoid loneliness, then wake up one day emotionally disconnected from their own instincts, their own needs, their own identity, smiling in rooms that quietly drain them, loving people who only ever knew the version of them that lacked boundaries. But healing changes that, not loudly, but quietly. Like a door inside your mind, slowly closing against everything that once consumed you. And once that door closes, you realize peace was never emptiness. It was freedom from performance, freedom from chasing, freedom from explaining, freedom from shrinking yourself so others could remain comfortable around your wounds. The more you heal, the less you tolerate. Because awareness leaves you with no other choice. You finally see what certain relationships cost your nervous system, your self-respect, your soul. And after seeing clearly for long enough, you stop negotiating against yourself just to keep people who were only loyal to the version of you that suffered silently. Because the deepest form of loneliness was never being alone. It was being disconnected from yourself while surrounded by everyone else. So now I want to ask you, what is one behavior, relationship, or pattern you used to tolerate that you can no longer ignore after healing? Comment it below.